And so I think this is also multi-layered. I think one, the economy in terms of just overall compliance, right? I think as we think about legislation, as we think about governing bodies and ultimately the laws that they put in place uh, for not just construction in general, but also the overall economy, that ultimately impacts how companies need to stay compliant with certain rules and regulations that ultimately um, are governing that specific industry. And so a good example of that is if we think about the Inflation Reduction Act, and if we think about how that ultimately impacts companies, especially construction, when it comes to green green solutions. And so, for example, there are certain energy protocols that now construction companies have to abide by and they have to meet from a code perspective. You sort of had your standard code, you have your stretch code, and then you have sort of your kind of more expanded stretch code, so to speak. And there's incentives for construction companies to abide by that. So that has economic impact because not only does the customer have to pay for that, right? They ultimately can get incentivized to adopt those green incentives, but you also have to think about it from the builders who are actually implementing and actually building these things with those green materials. The cost of those materials, the cost of labor. Are their labor trained? Are they fully developed to be aware of how to properly install those whatever material that they're being incentivized to build? And so ultimately how the economy and the different rules and regulations and laws that are put in place, those are going to impact construction companies. And then if we think just about the cost pressures and interest rates, right? Interest rates, again, as I mentioned earlier, they ultimately impact your borrowing power, right? And that borrowing power ultimately impacts what you decide to invest in, because the cost of borrowing, may be higher than what companies are used to in the past, 3 or 4 years. Back in 2020, interest rates were as low as 2, 3%, 4%. Now they're almost double that. So that not only has impacts on the construction company that's ultimately building, but it also has impacts on the customer and whether or not they want to move forward with these projects or hold them towards a later date, right? And so it's multi-layered. I think the economy can have so many different impacts when it comes to, operational efficiency, and ultimately the different materials that they're delivering, but also what investments they ultimately decide to choose to move forward with, because again, the economy ultimately dictates what the cost of borrowing is at that given point in time.